the second unit of this class, that is the colonial period and the Americas, or the colonial period in the Americas, is the first real content unit of this class. And where we are going to begin is traveling back in time, not necessarily in 1492 when. Yeah, I don't really care about Christopher Columbus, and you'll find out why at some point throughout this unit lecture. But where we are going to begin this story, is traveling back in time before, especially when talking about the Americas, traveling back in time before European exploration happened. Because there are millions of people's history happening prior to an old pasty white dude coming on shore of Virginia or Massachusetts Bay Colony and saying, hey, actually Newfoundland, and saying, hey, I found new land. That is false. That is not accurate. Because there's real people that lived in these lands before European contact, and they had lived there for a pretty long time. And our job at the beginning of this unit is to kind of find out why. But where we begin with this unit is me setting up for you guys this idea of the Great Divide within the Americas, that is between North and Latin and South America. So, a focus question for this unit, or for this lesson, is in the Americas, what is the Great Divide and what are its impacts? In the Americas, what is the Great Divide and what are its impacts? A lot of what we're going to talk about today is actually going to reinforce, I said we're going to come back and revisit Galeano. A lot of it's going to reinforce what we've already read in Open Veins and what has already been kind of stated, but we're going to look at it from a different kind of perspective. That's a very statistical standpoint. So, in the Americas, what is the Great Divide and what are its impacts? When I talk about this term called the Great Divide, I am talking about this separation in society, economic, social standpoint that our modern day 20th, 21st, 19th century standpoint has between these two regions of the Americas. You have roughly what is largely considered North America on the left side, and then you have largely Latin and South America on the right-hand side of this presentation. And what we're going to see with the Great Divide is that there's, for some reason, this distinction between largely the United States and Canada and everywhere else. And when I talk about this distinction, this kind of socially, I would say from a Eurocentric standpoint, accepted understanding that the United States is this global superpower, that is this first world country, and everything below it is not. And largely, throughout most of modern, I would say, world and US history textbooks, this kind of point of view has been reaffirmed. It has been reassured that the United States is this global superpower, and everywhere else in the Western hemisphere of the world really does not match up. But why has this story been told in a way that the United States is the only country that matters in the Western hemisphere? I think a lot of it kind of comes back to where we were at last week when we watched The Truth of the Danger of the Single Story, was this idea is that if you keep on saying one thing over and over and over again, and it finally makes its way into pop culture or just this generally held understanding of how life works or how life is, that's how people start to interpret it, even though it might be false. So we're going to look at some statistics over the past, I don't know, 50, we'll say 50 years. A lot of this data is going to demonstrate to you guys where things fall around 2013. So we're starting to get kind of out of date statistics. It might be time to start updating this. But if we're talking about the GDP meaning the value of goods produced, or a monetary measure of the market value of all final goods and services produced in a specific time period annually, meaning the sum amount of all goods and services produced within a country. Meaning, if this desk was built in the United States, which I highly doubt that it was, this desk, this binder, the pencils that you're using, the rulers that you have, the water bottles that you're consuming water out of was all constructed and built, assembled in the United States, in addition to the services produced, meaning, I guess we could say services. My wife owns a photography business. She doesn't really produce too much of a good, but she has a service that she provides. That also gets lumped into the GDP. So this is typically in terms of billions. In terms of billions. You see on this chart, you see the United States and Canada have a significant more amount of GDP per capita than Mexico does, by about 28,000 per capita. Why is that? The GNP in 2013, this means the country's income, what they're actually making, not the GDP, which is the value of goods produced, but the GNP, which is the total value of goods produced and services provided by a country during a year, equal to the gross domestic product plus the net income from foreign investments. We start to see a much drastic different picture, where you see the United States is tallying way off the charts in comparison to Canada or even Mexico as well. It's going to be a recurring theme throughout each one of these slides. I'm going to describe it to you, and then I'm going to have you guys write down a little bit about what GDP or GNP is, and then I'm going to say, why is that? Why is this completely different compared between Canada and Mexico and the United States? What is this division? Question? GNP is definition right here. Gross national product. Actually, no, it is not that. Gross national product. You're correct. Gross national product. All right. Here's a snapshot at infant mortality rates per 10,000 people in 2014. The red resembling the United States. You have Canada being the purple category. That is green. What we're seeing right here is that the United States, per 10,000 babies born, you have roughly 6 deaths per 10,000. You have roughly 4.5 in Canada. And then it skyrockets to about 21, 22 in Paraguay. Again, I'm going to ask you, why is that? Life expectancy rates in 2014 between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. While you might look at this chart from like in comparison to the others and see, okay, well, it doesn't seem like it's that much different. This is a completely different chart, though. It's saying, hey, this is the expectancy of life for people residing within that country. When you start talking about life expectancy, the amount of maybe 1 to 2 to 5 or 10 years is oftentimes more dramatic because typically you're only roughly given, give or take 100 years. And that's on the good note. What we're seeing here is in the United States, in 2014, the average life expectancy is around 80. In Canada, it's slightly better. It's about 83, 84 maybe. And then in Mexico, it dips down to about 74. Why is that? Literacy rates between the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Honduras. You have roughly 99, I believe that it's percentage here, 99% in the United States, 99% literacy people that are literate in Canada, 93.5% in Mexico. But when you get to Honduras, it's 4.5%. 4.5% of the population is quote unquote literate from the academic standpoint. Again, the question is, why is that? The average years of schooling between the United States, Canada, and Mexico and Guatemala, you have 12 mandated years of public education in the United States. You have roughly 11.6 in Canada, 7.2 in Mexico. Then when you get to Guatemala, you have roughly 3.5 years of schooling. And this is in the year 2000. Why is that? Birth rates, something that Galeano brought up, I think, repetitively throughout his introduction to open veins, is that the birth rate between Canada, United States, Mexico, and Guatemala is almost the complete opposite, in which we're looking at the birth rate compares the average annual number of births during a year per 1,000 people in the population in around the summer months of the year. You see that Guatemala is significantly more, and Guatemala and Mexico is significantly more than the United States and Canada. Again, why is that? Enrollment rates from 2007, meaning the amount of people that are applying for college between the United States and Latin America. You can't really see it, it's kind of off the charts, but 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, roughly 82%, whereas you have 30% throughout in Latin America. Again, why is that? Poverty rate, in terms of the percentage of the population in 2006 in the United States compared to Latin America. The poverty rate for the United States roughly coming in about 12 to 12.5% in 2006, whereas throughout Latin America, you have roughly 36 to 37% of the population lives at or below the poverty line. Why is that? To break this down a little bit more on the left-hand side, you have a breakdown of other specific countries, not just Latin America, but specific countries and their own individual poverty rate, which you see Honduras is at 71.5%. 71.5%, almost 3/4 of the population in Honduras live below the poverty line. In Mexico, 31.7% of the population lives at or below the poverty line. Chile is probably the only country that's relatively close to the United States in terms of the percentage of population that lives at or below the poverty line. But when you're talking about 13.7% of Chile's population, that's going to be a lot different than 13.7% of the United States' population. If you're looking at the chart on the right, you see the adult literacy rate in terms of the percentage of people that are age 51 and older that are literate. Right down right there. Again, the question again throughout all these statistics is why is that? Imports from Latin America. Imports from Latin America. We see that the top imports from Latin America in terms of billions is roughly, I'd say in terms of in billions, is 80 billion. This would be probably in terms of barrels. Petroleum products is the primary import from Latin America. Next would be motor vehicles, telecommunications equipment, followed, and appliances. So what we're seeing here is, in terms of imports from Latin America, is that a lot of the industry here is heavy industry, and also the acquisition of oil. Exports to Latin America is primarily electronics, motor vehicles, office machines, petroleum products, industrial machines. When we're talking about imports from, we're kind of talking from the United States standpoint, exports to. So I have a question here. We see petroleum products as one of the major imports from leaving the country. Why is petroleum products coming into the country when they have so much of it? Why is that? Motor vehicles, the same thing. That's the second biggest import from Latin America was motor vehicles. Why are they still importing a crap ton of motor vehicles when they're already exporting and when they're already importing them? Doesn't make sense. We're talking about the stability of the region of the Americas. You have the United States, really throughout the duration of the United States history, they have had one civil war. Throughout Latin America, largely these are different countries, they have had 14 civil wars since World War II. Read that again. They've had 14 civil wars throughout Latin America since World War II. Why is that? In terms of constitutions, documents that have set up governments, the United States has had two. Throughout Latin America, its various countries, there has been over 190 different constitutions established for its various countries and regions. 190, meaning the government has changed in one way, shape, or form 190 times. Again, my question is, you guys know it by now. Why is that? Yes. We're looking at the top U.S. products imported from Latin American countries in 2006. You have a breakdown here. I want you to take maybe 30 seconds within your groups, identify some interesting things that you see on this chart. And while you're talking within your groups, I want you to look at this. The top US products exported to Latin American countries in 2006. Talk about that within your groups. All right. Having looked at both of these graphs and the content within them, it kind of reaffirms a little bit of what we've been talking about. It kind of touched on a couple of the imports and exports I've already looked at. What I want you guys to think about tonight is this gift that I'm going to leave you with, or gift, or whatever you want to call it. And I want you to think about how this GIF is what it is describing. And I want you to think about how this could be highlighting not only the information that we talked about so far throughout this lecture, but also the information presented to Galliano. In this GIF, you see Forbes Global 2000 companies per country. I want you to ask yourself, why is that? And what I also want you to ask yourself is, if you were Eduardo Galliano, how would he be describing what you guys just looked at? How would he be describing what this great divide might be? I want you to think of Eduardo Galliano asking, why is that?